Hey, welcome everybody to the Talent and Strategy Show here on the Success is a Choice Podcasting Network. I'm your host, Jamy Bechler, and we appreciate you watching this live on YouTube, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, wherever you're watching this, or maybe you're listening to this on the Success is a Choice audio podcast. We appreciate it. We have a great show lined up for you today. And this show is brought to you by our friends over at Affinity Recruiting and Consulting. You can find out more about their work that they do to help you increase your mission, advance your mission, increase your bottom line. You can find them at affinitytoday.com, affinitytoday.com. Our thought for the day as we get into this, our overall theme is communications. Our thought for the day is learn to listen and listen to learn. Sometimes we think about communication as just talking. Well, we're going to talk with a communication expert here in just a few moments, and we're probably going to learn a little bit more that communication doesn't only involve talking. So we need to learn to listen and listen to learn. So our guest today, we'll bring her in here, Betsy Butterick. She's a communication specialist. She's a former college basketball coach. She works with high-level teams and organizations all over the place. She is a communication specialist. Betsy, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jamie, it's great to talk with you again. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And my wife, I told her that you were going to be on the show, and she said, oh, she's going to be a co-host. I said, no, just a one-time thing. And she says, I think Betsy should probably be on every show with you because I think that would improve your communication. So maybe you won't need to see about Betsy coming on the show every single week. I said, negative, bad idea. I don't need to feel guilty every single week.
And it's funny you say that. I was working with a coach this morning, and she said it was our first session together, so a discovery session. I was learning more about who she is and the challenges that she's facing. And at one point she said, I don't know how to say this well. And I said, what makes you feel like you need to say it well? And she's like, well, you're a communication specialist. And I said, yeah, here's the thing. Like, I wear that hat always, and it's never about judgment. So the best way for you to say something is whatever is most true for you. So if you could do that, I think we're going to be fine. And she's like, okay, I didn't know if my grammar had to be correct. I was like, I'm a terrible speller. I'll fully own that. So it's never about perfection. It's about intention. Can we have the intention to become a more skilled communicator? And shout out to your wife. I think she's a wonderful lady.
She is. And she puts up with me. I was a communication major in college. I think she must have been like a theater arts major or something, because she acts like she's listening to me quite a bit when I'm going off talking about stuff that she just rolls her eyes about. But, you said true to you. You talked about true to you. We might think keeping it real. I'm guessing that sometimes keeping it real is a good thing, but keeping it real can sometimes be a bad thing as well.
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of the truth. I'll say that first and foremost, right? So keeping it real, I'm all about the choices that we have in how we keep it real and when we keep it real and who we keep it real with, and specifically the language that we use during times of realness can absolutely have incredible impact on not only the relationship, but also what action we inspire through the conversations that we have.
Yeah. So we have a lot of different people listening to this. We have coaches, we have educators, administrators. We also have people from the business world. But at the end of the day, I'm guessing that there's quite a few communication mistakes or things that we do that just shoot ourselves in the foot. We essentially sabotage our own leadership or our own influence or the trust people might have with us. Give us just a couple things that we do to mess ourselves up or make our jobs tougher as leaders or whatever position we have.
Yeah. How much time do we have on the show? The list is long, Jamie, and it's long in part because communication is something that we do every day. And it's almost like a fish in a fishbowl. They don't know that they're in water because they're surrounded by it all the time. And so because communication is something that we spend so much of our day doing, very rarely do we stop to be truly intentional about our communication. And it typically shows up in moments where we're preparing to have an important conversation, whether that's with a colleague or coworker or an athlete, a coach, a spouse, or significant other. These are the times that we tend to be really intentional, specifically about what we want to say. And as you mentioned earlier, learn to listen, listen to learn. There's so many more facets of communication than simply what we say. Where do people make mistakes or get in their own way? And I'll say this encompasses probably like 92% of the work that I do, whether it's working with businesses or working with coaches or working with programs, is how do we shorten the distance between intention and impact? And oftentimes the challenges that we find in communication, the barriers to communication, are the things that prevent someone from receiving our message as intended. Whether that message is spoken or it's through our actions or behaviors, miscommunication occurs when I, the sender, have a certain intention and you, the receiver, do not receive that message as intended. A few barriers that are very common are context, tone, trust, timing, clarity, word choice, and body language. Those I like to think of as the big seven. Typically, when a miscommunication occurs, rarely is it just one of those. I wish it was, because that would be a simpler fix. They typically come in combination. So it's like a miscommunication cocktail, if you will, that then just gets passed around. And what the biggest challenge often is those barriers, those mistakes in communication, those aren't the biggest issue. The biggest issue are the choices that we make about clarifying miscommunication when it happens. Because oftentimes, common scenario is you say something, I don't receive it as intended. I'm going to go talk to a colleague, coworker, peer, significant other about what you said and ruminate in that space, but never come back to you to address the miscommunication. And so now we've got a little bit of a divide. I'm likely harboring some resentment or even just a jaded perspective. And now confirmation bias kicks in. And every time you speak, I'm looking for confirmation of the judgment that I made during the miscommunication that we had. And things continue to grow from there. So we are so close and yet so far often in our communication with others to having better understanding, to creating stronger connection. And that's most of the work that I find myself centered in.
Well, little later in the show, we're going to have our quote of the day, and it's actually from Stephen Covey talking about most of us listen with the intent to reply. We come with our own biases or our own baggage, or we don't listen with the intent to learn. And you just talked about confirmation bias. How does that show up, whether you're a coach working with players, or you're a spouse, or you're a CEO or a manager working with an employee, or the reversal roles, an
Right.
employee with a boss, so to speak? How does confirmation bias play into our daily lives?
I'll back up and say a quote that keeps coming to mind for me since we started this conversation is Brene Brown. And the context was, I believe she was speaking for the first time to a group of Fortune 500 CEOs. And she was having a bit of imposter syndrome, thinking, who am I to be speaking in front of this group? And what was calming for her was this idea of people are people. That regardless of title, regardless of stature, regardless of experience, they're people. And so coming from that perspective, when we look at the miscommunication that occurs, and remind me, Jamy, the question that you just asked, because I got stuck on remembering the people part.
The confirmation bias.
Oh, confirmation bias. Yes. Okay. So I say people because this is a very human thing. Our brains are meaning-making machines. We get a small hit of dopamine whenever we make a connection, when we understand something. And so this happens continually in the background while we're conversing with other people. Even if it's someone that we're meeting for the first time, as soon as I think I've figured out something about that person, I get that little dopamine hit. And then, just like a drug of choice, I'm going to continue to search for data or bits of information that reaffirm the judgment that I've made or the characterization that I've made. Where this becomes a challenge is when that characterization was incorrect or biased or jaded in some way. Common example I come across in sports. Let's say a junior in college, so third year in their program, has an interaction with their head coach, and they leave that interaction feeling, oh, coach got pretty defensive in that conversation. Now, I said context is one of the barriers to communication. Given the context, if we were present, there might have been very valid reasons why anyone might get defensive in that situation. But let's say student athlete walks away thinking coach is defensive. And then the next weekend is a recruiting weekend. So they have prospective student athletes on campus. One of the individuals is someone who's already signed, so they know this is going to be a future teammate. And that junior, at some point in casual conversation over the weekend, says to the incoming freshman, hey, just so you know, coach can get a little defensive. And I'm telling you this only because I want you to be aware coming in so that it's on your radar. Great intention. I want to take care of my teammate. Terrible impact, because now that individual who may never have thought coach was defensive before now has that characterization in mind. Confirmation bias kicks in, and any conversation they have directly or they observe of that coach, they're looking for affirmation that that's true. When confirmation bias is present, we stop looking for information that would counteract that judgment or prove it, or I'll say disprove it more specifically. So this is something that it benefits us to be aware of, because just when we think we know, and there's a great quote, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to articulate it exactly as it was written, but the quote was something to the effect of, it's not what you don't know that hurts you. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. So curiosity, like having the ability to question our beliefs. And I think it was this past February when Adam Grant's most recent book came out. And I love the premise of the book simply because it's asking us to question our knowledge, and that true knowledge isn't what you've learned or accumulated over the course of your life. It's what you're willing to re-examine or rethink that's the source of true wisdom. And the book was called Think Again. I realized I didn't say that part.
Well, I know as a coach, I've been here. I've been here with my son. I've been here in lots of interactions. I have something I need to tell them. So, Betsy, I need to tell you something.
Yep.
So it's going to be a one-way communication. I'm going to
Okay.
tell you this. I want you to get better, or I need you to improve, or you need this, have this correction. But sometimes I feel like that's not the way to go about it. The one-way communication. Sometimes we probably need to ask a few more questions, or we can't always be all about business, I guess. What kind of questions? Are there some times when we should be asking questions instead of just telling somebody what to do?
Absolutely. And again, whether you are a coach or you're a manager or a leader or someone who simply wants to support other people, I highly recommend the Socratic method of teaching or using motivational interviewing. And if you're less familiar with either of those concepts, it benefits you to spend some time looking into them, because these are skills, communication skills that anybody can learn. As a coach specifically, and I'm going to take it back into a sports background because that's kind of my home, it's so much easier, and this is true in business as well, in the construct of time. We have very limited time. So it's so much easier to tell someone to do something or what we need to happen instead of to ask questions. And yet it's a deeper level of learning when we ask instead of tell. So let's go basketball example. If we're in the middle of practice and we're working on our defense, but someone's out of position, it would be very easy for me to blow the whistle and say, hey, when the ball's here, you need to be here. Very different experience, better quality learning experience when I blow the whistle, instead of saying, hey, when the ball's here, you need to be here, I say, hey, when the ball's here, where do you need to be? It's a very small shift, and yet it does so much to increase the stickiness of the learning. And in addition, when I make that comment of when the ball's here, you need to be here, that's just about that person. When I say when the ball's here, where do you need to be? While I'm asking that question to one person, their teammates are also thinking, how would I answer that question? And so I've not only deepened the learning experience for that individual, but also for those around them, which ideally when we're trying to coach a team, we want everyone to be on the same page or to have shared understanding. And so asking a question can help facilitate that as well. Now, oftentimes the questions that I hear coaches ask, two challenges come up. One, they ask a rhetorical question. An example would be middle of practice. Let's say the energy is not really where you want it to be. And I hear a coach say, is that as hard as we can go? That's not really a question that you're asking them to answer. You know the answer, or else you wouldn't be asking the question. You know they can give more. They know they can give more. The challenge with this is when we ask rhetorical questions, questions that we're not truly expecting an answer from, what it teaches our student athletes or anybody is that they're not required to respond. And so then further down the line, we're having a team huddle or we're having a staff meeting if we're in a place of business, and I ask a question that I do want an answer to, and all I get is silence. And then I'll have coaches or managers or leaders come back to me and say, I'm asking, but nobody's saying anything. And it's like, let's look at other times or situations when you've asked a question. So unintentionally asking rhetorical questions trains people to not respond. So that's one of the challenges. Another challenge with the questions is when you ask why, and especially in heated situations across all disciplines and professions. When something is challenging for us, we often ask a why question. Again, our brains are meaning-making machines. We want to understand. So why did you do this? Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why the nature of the word causes defensiveness, even if that's not our intention. So we're much more likely to get better quality information and avoid that initial defensiveness if in place of why, we asked what or how. So what did you see happening there? How did you see that going? What objective were you trying to achieve? So it's not just asking questions. Is asking better than telling in certain situations? Yes. And again, the first barrier I mentioned was context. There are certain situations where we have to say directly in a one-way communication structure what needs to happen. And can we be intentional about creating opportunities to ask questions so as to deepen the quality of the learning experience for the person that we're supporting? And also, can we be intentional about how we ask the question to get the best quality information back?
Okay, so let's say I am probably your answer is going to be similar, but let's say you're a player who wants more playing time, wants a better
Mm,
role, and you need to go talk, you need to go talk to the coach. Or you're an employee who wants to get a raise or wants, an extra day off for Christmas or whatever it is. How do you, if you're in a lesser position, let's say, how do you persuade someone or how do you communicate with someone? You talked about with Brene Brown, kind of that imposter syndrome. Sometimes there's going to be maybe not the imposter, but you're going to feel threatened, or you're going to feel like, hey, I'm way down here, or I'm not prepared. I'm not good enough at talking to talk to this
mhm.
person, or I'm scared to talk to them. Are there some things that a person could do when they're talking with someone that's maybe above them on an organizational flow chart?
Absolutely. And there's not just one, there's many. The one that I'm going to focus on right now is this idea of framing. And framing is a technique that you can use to ask for what you want in a way that entices or persuades the other person to say yes more often than no. I have an ACT video on this. So ACT stands for Active Communication Technique. These are short videos on YouTube. They're roughly 3 minutes or less, and they're designed to give anybody something they can do today to improve the way that we communicate and connect with each other. Act 24 is called Framing Your Ask. So if you'd like a visual and kind of a walkthrough of this technique, that's available for you. The premise of it is when you put in time listening, so this goes back to the opening quote there, Jamy, about learn to listen, listen to learn. When we put in time listening, people will tell us everything we could hope to know about what's important to them, what they value, what they're into. When we have that information, we can then use that information to frame our request of that person. So regardless of what the power dynamics are, this technique works across disciplines.
Mm.
When you ask for something in the context of what someone else values, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to say no, because saying no to your request also means saying no to the thing that's important to them. And it doesn't feel good to do, and so they're less likely to do it. So if I knew, Jamy, that let's say, let's go back to the playing time example, right? If I wanted more playing time, but I knew like, maybe I haven't quite put in the work yet, or I haven't been doing everything I can possibly do to earn more playing time. The first thing that I'm likely going to do in that situation is what I call an admission of vulnerability. So I want to take ownership for my part in not having the playing time that I want. When we do this, we lower defenses right away. And this is something that oftentimes, people want to cite outside sources or blame other factors for why they're in the situation that they're in. It is a completely different experience, especially if you're requesting something that's important to you, to start the conversation with ownership and also with gratitude. So an example, talking about playing time, I might say, Coach, I want to have a conversation with you about something that's important to me. And I first want to start by owning the fact that when it comes to playing time, I realize I haven't done everything I could possibly do to earn that. And that's on me. I can stay a few minutes after a couple times a week. There are things that I can do outside of our practice time in order to improve my skills. So that's a commitment that I'd like to make moving forward. I'm grateful for the opportunity to have the playing time that I've gotten thus far. And the question that I'd like to ask you is, how can I improve to help the team improve? Now, in that last question, the framing is important. So I'm asking specifically about me, because when it comes to playing time, and whether it's playing time in athletics or salaries in our jobs, we often want to talk about other people. So what is it about my situation compared to someone else's? Well, I think I should be playing over so-and-so because so-and-so does this. If you're on the receiving end of that conversation, it benefits us to bring the focus back to the individual in front of us. And that's why the phrasing of that question is important. Coach, how can I improve to help our team improve. That second part is crucially important and of great value to the coach. And you can replace coach with manager or leader or parent, right? How can I as an individual be better to help us be better? Because I know that's important to the coach. We want to be the best that we can be. And so I'm asking for information that I can then take action on to get the result that we're both looking for.
Very good. And if you're a parent of an athlete and you're listening to this, that last part, that last part, very rarely does an athlete ask it that way, or even a parent ask it that way. It almost always, the punchline is, how can I get more playing time?
Yeah.
Not how can I help the team more? And playing time almost can become a byproduct, but that's the real question. That's the good question, not how can I get more playing time? Because it's also a very selfish, in some ways, it's a selfish question as opposed to how can I help the team more?
Yep.
And as a former coach, you know, I appreciate that when a kid or an athlete wants to be coachable, and that appears that like they want to be coachable. It appears like, how can I help the team? How can I add value? As opposed to just, how can I get something just for me?
Yeah. And as a coach, Jamie, I mean, that's a kid that I look for opportunities to play. Even just asking the question in that way, having that intention, expressing the gratitude, taking ownership, like, you have my respect. Let's find you opportunities to play. Same thing if we're talking about business as well. And you mentioned the question being a poor question. There's a great phrase from, I believe it's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, that book, where it talks about this concept of MU, M-U, and it means unask the question. There's a better question to be asked. And so often, again, going back to, challenging conversations or missed opportunities for connection, we can improve the quality of our questions. And the quality of our relationships, of our experiences, largely depends on the quality of our questions. So how can we get intentional about asking better questions so that we create better connections, so that we get better quality information, so that we have more intentional experiences with each other?
Well, and you bring something up there with the connection, the interactions we have, the questions we ask. This can take place in just our normal friend or normal day-to-day interactions. It can also take place in a team. It can also take place in a corporate setting, but we try to make a connection. Betsy, you live in Colorado Springs. I find that out. I might automatically start talking about my trip to Colorado or me
Yeah.
skiing or that. But I've heard you talk about that's maybe not the best way to connect, even though we think we're making a connection with you, but we're actually making it all about us.
Yeah. And again, like this is back to intention and impact. Your intention with telling me about the time you were in Colorado Springs is great. And what you're trying to do is say, oh, I have a connection to the place that you live. I've had an experience there. Let me tell you about it so that we feel like we have something in common. Lovely intention. And we do it all the time. This is what I call a Me Too statement. So in any conversation, again, with someone we know well or a complete stranger, when they bring up a topic that we've had some experience about, our gut reaction almost is to tell a Me Too story. So I'm going to tell you something about my life or my experience that relates to the topic that you just brought up. What's interesting is we create a stronger connection when instead of Me Too, we go with what I like to call more you. And more you is any question that allows the other person to tell you more about their experience or who they are or what they're into or what they value. So same situation, Jamie, if you know you've been to Colorado Springs, and I tell you, hey, Jamie, I just moved to Colorado Springs, you've got that gut reaction of, oh, I want to tell Betsy about the time I was in Colorado Springs. Instead of telling a Me Too story, what's a more you question that you could ask me about my time in Colorado Springs instead of just telling me about yourself?
So how would that, I think that that's a great, ever since I heard you say that a couple of years ago, I've tried to watch myself
Mm,
in those interactions. And I think it was, in How to Win Friends and Influence People, that book, a century ago, the author Carnegie talks about how the most interesting person is, you're interesting if you get the other person talking about themselves, because everybody
mm,
likes themselves. Everybody likes to talk about themselves. And so even in a conversation, if you get somebody talking about themselves, they'll actually find you interesting. But how I love that idea in relationships. How can that apply to, like, say, a business setting? So you're a
mhm.
C-suite person, you're a manager, you're a supervisor. How can that play into, all right, I've got this employee trying to make widgets and we want them to be more productive. How can the me too or more you type stuff come into that setting?
Yeah, anytime, and I often say this, I truly think leaders are the first listeners or the best listeners. The best leaders are a combination of both, first and best. Leaders put in an exceptional time listening. Not all leaders, but truly great leaders are very intentional about the quality of their listening. Even in a conversation, if I were to take a sample conversation, let's say 5 minutes between a leader, let's say a CEO, C-suite executive, and somebody that they're managing. In that leadership conversation, and I call it a leadership conversation, it's probably just a conversation, but if we're looking at it through the lens of leadership, what I'm looking for is a ratio of listening to speaking that is somewhere around at least 60-40 listening to speaking. Great listeners are going to expand that out to about 80-20. So I'm going to put in much more time listening than I am speaking. When I speak, I'm going to ask really intentional questions, high quality questions. And when I'm not asking a question, I'm going to be sharing or making statements that facilitate or foster connection. If we can look at communication through that lens, how much time am I putting in listening versus speaking? When I do speak, what's coming out of my mouth? How much of what I say is a question versus a statement versus, sharing a story or modeling vulnerability, whatever it happens to be. Like, what are we doing with the time that we're spending speaking? And how can we better use that time to facilitate an objective that we have, whether it's creating widgets and getting to understand the engineer behind those widgets and what they value and how they saw the plan for the widget going and why, and where they got that creativity from, and what's been similar in the past that they found challenging. There's so many different directions that we can go. And the intention is, okay, how much time am I putting in listening? When I'm speaking, what is coming out of my mouth? How am I using that time? And is that the best use of time in order to achieve the objective that we're trying to get in this partnership?
Well, oftentimes, and I found this as a coach, and unfortunately, you typically see it after the fact, not when it's actually happening, and hopefully, we can always improve and get better at seeing it as it's happening. But when we talk, we don't learn anything new. When we talk, we're only putting out what we already know. And so
Right.
when we're trying to motivate or, hey, what makes so and so tick? How can I get so and so to do this job or this responsibility better? The more I talk, and this goes back to an earlier question, but the more I tell them what to do, the less I'm finding out about them.
Yeah. Yeah. You're holding that space. It's interesting when we talk about space. And I think it was a book by, I believe, Wendy Palmer. And I think the book was Leadership Embodiment. That was the first time I really started to think about conversations as taking a shape, like having a physical space. And even as a facilitator and as an executive coach, thinking about being someone who has the responsibility to create a container for a conversation. And what is the conversation asking for? What does the conversation need from me as someone who's intentionally responsible for holding that space? So when we think about leadership, and again, I'm going to go coaching example, it would be the same in business if we're talking about mentoring someone. Oftentimes as coaches, we see the potential in an athlete and we keep inviting them into that space, right? And we keep being like, I know you can do this, I believe in you and you have what it takes and you've done the work, and we fill that space. Oftentimes, if we are going to allow them to evolve into that space, to actually show us that they can do it, we need to take a step back. We can't keep being that person, that driver of motivation. We need to be able to step back and invite them into the space while also leaving space for them to take a step forward, for them to start to own something, for them to start to exhibit behavior that models our belief that we have in them. And this is where the idea of motivational interviewing becomes extremely important, because that models perfectly that release of space. I'm not going to hold this space and just shout my belief to you until you are inspired to believe in yourself. I am going to state my intention and belief, and then I'm going to ask questions that allow me to learn more about how do you tick and what's motivating for you. And then you, through questioning, are going to be guided to a place where you want to take the action that ideally I see for you, but it's fully out of my control to make you take. And I find myself saying this often to leaders, executives, and to coaches is we can't make people do anything. We think we can, and some people still like to motivate through fear or threats or, the illusion of control. All we can really do is invite. And is what you're inviting someone into something that is ideal or attractive or supportive or beneficial for them, not just for you, for them. And we can use language to make this true.
So you mentioned earlier about a ratio of maybe nonverbal or listening
Yeah.
to non or listening to talking. I think of another ratio when it comes to communication, and coaches talk about this all the time, but maybe the ratio of positive to negative. And
Mm,
they might talk about a sandwich approach, and you hear it a lot in
yeah.
coaching. Uh, but C-suite executives, people, anyone that's dealing with people will have to deal with this at some time. And maybe they've talked about the sandwich approach. Are you a fan of the sandwich approach? Is there a better way of handling not necessarily conflict, but when you have to deliver bad news or deliver correction?
Yeah, there's so many ways. And whenever anyone mentions the sandwich, I always think about a colleague of mine who's from Australia. And she told me, in Australia, they call it a shit sandwich because it's still in there. It's in the middle. You just put, bread on both sides. And I don't know if you'll have to bleep that out or anything. I'm sorry if you do, Jamie. But when it comes to giving feedback, a few things I've found to be true. The first is before you criticize, connect. When we're going to give anybody feedback, if we want them to take it in to be receptive, especially if it's something that might be difficult for them to hear, we first need to establish relationship. That person has to know and believe that we have their best interest at heart. So before you criticize, connect. The second piece, I'm going to flip those words, is when you criticize, connect. Can you connect intentionally your criticism, your feedback to something that they are actively working on or in pursuit of, or that is an established goal of theirs? So I'm not just telling you something because I feel like telling you something. I'm telling you something because it relates to something of value for you. So before you criticize, connect. When you criticize, connect. Now, having the conversation, most people have a fear or aversion to difficult conversations because what's true for most people is they've yet to be taught how to do these well, how to be skillful in these moments,
Mm.
and or they've had some not ideal experiences with this in the past, whether they've tried to give someone feedback and it hasn't gone well, or they've been given feedback in a way that wasn't well received on their part. So we avoid these kinds of conversations for really great reasons. And when done well, these can be some of the most connective and empowering types of conversations that we have with other people. Even if, and I'm thinking about the book, Crucial Conversations, one of the tools that they offer in that book is this idea of a contrasting statement. And a contrasting statement has two parts. It's a don't do part, or don't do statement. So two parts. The don't part is what you say in order to articulate whatever it is you don't want the other person to misinterpret or misunderstand. When we think about normal people having a difficult conversation, it's whatever you're afraid the other person is going to think. And typically that's very clear for most people. So that becomes your don't statement. Articulate what you don't want them to think or take away or misunderstand, followed by what you do want them to understand or take away, your true intention or purpose. Where I see people mess this up is when they put that little word called but in the middle. Because if you say, I don't want you to think this, but it's like, okay, that's gone. And now they're going to focus and keep that misunderstanding. An example, Jamie, would be, I don't want people to think I know everything there is to know about communication. I do hope to offer people tools and frameworks and skills, knowing that people are complex and the communication between people even more so.
Every time I listen to you talk, I have that imposter syndrome or the Teddy Roosevelt quote of comparison is the thief of all joy. I'm like, where were you when I was paying a lot of money to go to college and get a
Yeah.
degree in communication? I mean, we needed to hear from people like you. You have a great way of putting things, and I think anyone listening to this, if they just take one or two nuggets and not improve their life overnight, I mean, you don't improve your life in a day. You improve it with some daily changes. But I love the things and the way you frame stuff. I appreciate that. So what are your uh, not necessarily blind spots, but what are the things you're working on? Because yes, you're a communication expert, but in the same way I talk about leadership or I talk about teamwork, sometimes I'm selfish and not a very good teammate in my family, or sometimes I'm not a very good leader in my family. What are some things that maybe you're working on or you would like to do better from a communication area?
Yeah, and this is, I'll say, one of the challenges and also one of the true privileges of doing the work that I get to do as a communication specialist. I think title alone, people expect me to get it right all the time. And the times that I learn the most from, as far as my personal growth and development, especially in this profession, are the times where it doesn't land as intended or I make a mistake. And thankfully, with a lot of practice, I'm becoming more aware in real time of when something is off. And so I'm able to do reparative work in the moment. That will be a continual journey, just to go through life living in the moment authentically, trying to be intentional and skillful about the interactions, communications that I have with other people, also knowing that there are going to be times when I miss the mark, and making sure that I take appropriate action, or at least if, let's say, another conversation isn't possible or it's not possible in the moment to make reparations of some kind, can I at least take that lesson and pay it forward? Can I make that part of a workshop or a podcast or a seminar, and in some way add value to other people through the error or mistake that I've made? For me personally, I I'm working on patience. And if you've met me, anyone that knows me would say, I in general, I'm a kind person, a nice person. I try to be a good quality human being. And so I think they would think that patience is, kind of part of that package. And especially having a young daughter, we have a 20-month-old. I am learning new depths of patience, especially when I have an agenda. And I think that this parallels into my work as a communication specialist. As a coach, when I'm doing executive coaching, when I'm working with a team, it's never about me. And anytime I have an agenda, I need to check myself and say, okay, am I directing them where I think they need to go? Or am I directing them where it's most beneficial for them to go? Because although I like to think those two things are always in alignment, sometimes I realize that they're not. And what I might think someone needs, whether that someone is an individual or an organization, I have to be really intentional about making sure that that's also best for them. And best for them doesn't mean easy or enjoyable or fun. I always try to make it so. And yet I recognize that with any kind of change, there's always challenge, there's adversity, there's fear, there's unlearning that has to happen. So if I'm going to guide someone down that path and support that growth and development, I've got to be really sure that, at least with the best of intentions, this is the right direction for them. So anytime I have an agenda, whether it's working with others or with my toddler, where like, I want to leave the house at this time because I want to do this thing, I feel like she knows, and then she enters sloth mode. And it's like, I'm going to take 10 minutes to climb down the stairs backwards, right? So it's like just learning to let go of maybe the plan for what was, and being able to work fully in the moment with whatever arises. And for that to not just be okay, but even ideal, of like, okay, this is good. I'm learning something that I are having the opportunity to practice something that maybe I hadn't intended today.
Yep. You're essentially a consultant. You help people get better. You consult, you pour out your wisdom, but you're a much better consultant because you were a coach. You've been where a lot of these people have been. There's a lot of consultants out there that are just book smart and they haven't lived that life. I think of that when you talk about parenting. My son Jalen just turned 13 this week.
Wow.
Well, 14 years ago, I was an amazing parent. I knew it all
Right.
about parenting. I don't know where that knowledge went because I thought I knew it all. You talking about your daughter, it's one of those, it's just a crazy thing that when you start living through it, you start, the rubber meets the road and you start to get
Yeah.
those experiences that then you can also pay forward and help other people with. But yeah, it's always interesting when we go through this kind of stuff. And no matter how long you've coached, how long you've been a parent, how long you've been a manager, whatever, you still make mistakes. It
Yep.
doesn't matter. But how are you going to deal with those mistakes?
Right.
Let's get into our quote of the day. We will finish up with this. It's from Stephen Covey. Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. They're either speaking or preparing to speak. They're filtering everything through their own paradigms, reading their autobiography into other people's lives. So, in other words, people are figuring out what they're going to say and they're not paying attention to what you're saying. And oftentimes we're losing valuable information. How many times do coaches or managers or supervisors or parents bang their head against the wall? Kids these days, or our employees, millennials, or whatever generation, whatever. I just don't understand them. Well, you haven't listened to them. You
Yeah.
haven't found out about them. So, Betsy, want to give you the last word, obviously on communication, that quote, any parting thoughts
Yep.
for our audience?
Yeah, I've got three actually. When you're talking about, you haven't listened to them. So often when we haven't listened to someone that we have a challenge with, it's because we've put in that time making judgments instead of trying to understand. So if we can replace judgment with a quest for greater understanding, that's going to lead us a lot closer to connection. Another thought, there's a Stephen Covey quote that I use often in one of my presentations called, "We see the world not as it is, but as we are, or as we've been trained to see it." And that gets into, the exact same thing that autobiography mentioned in that quote. You asked about common miscommunications or barriers earlier. And the biggest one that we've all likely heard or read somewhere is that we don't listen to understand, we listen to reply. What I've learned over time, Jamy, is that this is a very human thing to do. And there's reasons biologically why this happens. Most people speak at an average rate of about 150 words per minute. We all have someone who speaks a little more quickly or a little more slowly, on average, about 150 words per minute. Most people have the ability to listen up to 1,000 words per minute. So if we're speaking at 150, but we're listening up to 1,000, that's a lot of extra space. And what we tend to do with that space is think about what we want to say next. So this is a very normal, natural, very human thing to do. And we know that when we're doing that, we're not fully listening. And so the question I ask people to keep in mind when they find themselves drifting into thinking about what I want to say next is to ask themselves the question, what can I learn? What can I learn? What can I learn? What can I learn? Because when I have that question on repeat, I'm activating my curiosity and I'm becoming a more intentional listener in that space. So especially with the people that we talk with frequently or we know well, those are the people we most often stop asking that question with, because I could finish their sentence. Of course, I know what they're going to say. Well, now we're not listening to the degree that we could otherwise, and we're missing important information that might foster connection.
When people change too, or
Yeah.
they have some ebbs and flows and ups and downs. So maybe Betsy, maybe her whole thought process hasn't changed. Maybe her whole
Yep.
personality hasn't changed, but maybe today or this week she's going through something different. And so listening to her today and not filling in that sentence, or not just coming in with this confirmation bias of, oh, I know what Betsy means. Well, Betsy might mean something different today.
Yeah, it's the same thing when I enter a session with a client, or whether it's been a month since I was last on site with a team or an organization, is can I allow them to make a fresh impression? I always think of silly putty. It's like, okay, when I arrive on site or I go into that meeting with an individual, it's like I'm opening the silly putty and I'm going to allow them to make whatever impression is true for them today. And I'll often start individual sessions with the question, is there anything that's come up since the last time we were together that you'd like to start today's time with? Just for an opportunity for them to clue me in from the get-go if there's anything different that they want me to be aware of. But really having that intention of, can we allow people to make a fresh impression on us, regardless of how much time it's been since we last saw them? Because life happens in the space between. So what we knew or what we know may not be as true as we think it is.
Well, that's awesome stuff. You can reach out to her at her website, betsybutterick.com. We'll put all the links in the show notes. Betsy, we really appreciate your time. We appreciate all the audience listening, whether you were watching this live today, whether watching this on replay or listening to it. Our next show will be the same time, Thanksgiving. It'll be the day after Thanksgiving. So next Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern time, we will convene again for another show of the Talent and Strategy. Remember, success is a choice. What choice will you make today?